So what types of trauma therapy treatment practices do you employ? And do you recommend certain types of therapy for current religious trauma sufferers?
So not every therapist is a trauma therapist. In my opinion, every therapist should be a trauma therapist, but there are a lot of people who really are not competent in treating trauma. So I use a lot of EMDR and IFS, which were both covered in your training. And I do a lot of family of origin work. I am an LMFT, and I think the family of origin work is very, very important. I also do a lot of relearning boundaries and communication and assertiveness skills. If you're looking for trauma treatment, I absolutely, absolutely recommend that you find somebody who is trained in, and it doesn't have to be all of these things, but it should be either or any combination of EMDR, IFS, brain spotting, somatic experiencing, or sensory motor. Those are the things that are the cutting edge trauma treatment that actually create change in the nervous system. And they're not just cognitive restructuring is not adequate for trauma.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning EMDR and somatic and IFS. As so far, this is what our research is indicating as well, that they are having the most impact on trauma patients and religious.
You cannot CBT trauma. And if anybody tells you you can CBT trauma, they don't know what they're talking about.
But explain the CBT thing. And do you recommend, or would you at least be open to something like psilocybin and other psychedelics?
So yes, I have had a few clients who have done ketamine. Ketamine is very helpful. I would definitely say for most people, it needs to be done in conjunction with therapy. I have also noticed that and I don't have a ton of experience with ketamine. I have not used it myself. My clients that have used it had really strong effects at the beginning, and then it kind of wears off after a while and you need to get boosters. And I know they're still researching that, and I am not an expert on that. I know psilocybin, they're doing a lot of research on, and that the future looks very promising for psychedelics. And yes, I would recommend with your doctor that it's outside of my scope, but yes, I know that there's a lot of really good research on psychedelics and trauma. So talk to your doctor more about that. CBT, did you want me to explain why CBT is not adequate?
Yes, please.
So CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. And the cognitive part in particular works with our prefrontal cortex. And so we can do lots of, working with our cognitions and our thoughts and restructuring them so that they make more sense. And we can get to a point where we can say, well, I know that, I'm just using this as an example. I know that, it wasn't my fault when I was molested as a 5-year-old, and that man who did that to me was wrong. But in my soul, I'm still going to feel the shame and the harm. Restructuring the prefrontal cortex does not reach down into my body, but the trauma does reach down into my body. So there's top down, no, pardon me, this is the explanation I give all the time. So we have our prefrontal cortex, we have our lower brain, and our lower brain is responsible for fight, flight, freeze, and another fourth F word that has to do with reproduction. So fight, flight, freeze, and reproduce. And then our middle brain has to do a lot with our emotions. And then our prefrontal cortex makes language. And for people that can do math, they use their prefrontal cortex. Mine doesn't do math. And this brain, in terms of evolution, is millions of years old. This middle brain, our mammalian brain, is hundreds of thousands of years old. In terms of evolution, our prefrontal cortex is only about 10,000 years old. But in your own individual self, this brain is fully functional before you're born. The mammalian brain is fully functional at about the age of 3. Your prefrontal cortex isn't fully functional until you are 25 years old. 25, like you're through college, married, and have children before this is even done developing. Also, when I clap my hands and I surprise you, your lower brain has assessed and determined that there's no threat within hundredths of a second. And it takes almost a full second for your prefrontal cortex to even know what happened and think, why did she just clap her hands like that? So this works hundreds of times faster than this does. So you're never going, if you have this one and this one in a wrestling match, this one will always win. So we can't use words, we can't use logic on this brain because it's a lizard brain. Lizards, you can't logic with a lizard. This is your lizard brain. So, all the cognitive therapy in the world will never get down into your lizard brain. It will never get down into your body. And so we need these emotional, body-based, non-linear, embodied feeling interventions to restructure what happens below the prefrontal cortex. Does that make sense? And Peter Levine is the author that you want to, everybody likes Bessel van der Kolk. I like Bessel van der Kolk too. I think Peter Levine does a better job of explaining what I just explained.
I want to bring in my own personal experience and insight when it comes to psychedelics and EMDR. I was told that ketamine and psilocybin would be a major, almost the magic pill to help me with my childhood trauma. And lo and behold, I had attempted the psilocybin and to no effect. It had, and I took it under care of a doctor, no effect on my system. They upped the dose on the second time, absolutely no effect. And what you come to find out is if you are on certain prescription meds, the psychedelics don't really work. And in order to get me to actually have an effect with psilocybin, they did something like 6 times a dose that they would ever recommend for treatment. And I personally went through about a 9-hour hell marathon where I lived and experienced and worked out the trauma out of my nervous system. And what was significant about this was there was no shutting it off. I mean, once that roller coaster ride started, it had to go completely full cycle until the meds were gone, until the psilocybin was out of my body.
Wow.
Luckily I had people around me and we had prepared the entire day for this event. It was brutal. One of the most exhausting experiences of my life. I was sore for days because you can imagine, as you know, working trauma out of your nervous system.
Wow.
It was a 9-hour workout. And I say this, one, to be transparent that it is scary and it's a rough experience. But two, it was very much worth it. I did walk out of that with a bit of a new lease on life. However, it was not until I started doing EMDR work, intensive EMDR work, that I really actually felt my brain restructure itself, my neural pathways. I, to this day, feel the neural pathways change and mold. So with a completely new worldview, new perspective, new attitude, and that, to me, having done both psychedelic work with psilocybin and then the EMDR, hands down, I would recommend doing something like EMDR or somatic trauma therapy because it seems to have a lasting effect. It genuinely restructures the brain.
The research shows that, and they're doing research on all of the other ones. The other ones that I named are so cutting edge that they're doing the research, but it's not all done. Whereas EMDR kind of set the foundation for trauma work, and they've put there's been a dedicated team researching it for 30 years. And so there's actually more research published on EMDR than any other model except for CBT. And of course, you can never catch up with CBT because CBT was the standard for so long. But what they are showing specifically with IFS and EMDR, and that they'll show it with the other ones as well, is that there is a lasting permanent change.
Mm.
Whereas if you were to go to a CBT therapist and they say, oh yes, we're going to use trauma-focused CBT on your therapy, on your trauma, 2 years later, you're going to be back with symptoms and you're going to say, well, I know we did this and I know we did this, but why am I having nightmares again? Because it doesn't get down deep into the body. It's all right here.
Right. And that's actually was my experience with cognitive behavioral therapy, was this notion that I just needed to think differently about my trauma, and that I could fake it till I make it almost. If I just had a better mindset, or if I learned to think about things differently. And it had very temporary effects on me. I would walk out of a counseling session feeling like, yeah, I can take on the world. I get it now. I'm understanding stuff. And it wouldn't last.
Yes, that's my feeling about CBT as well. And not that it's not useful at all. I don't want to say that everything about CBT is bad. You're always going to have a cognitive piece, right? Like, in EMDR, we work in cognitive interweaves. Those come from CBT.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. You don't just do EMDR.
Right. It's within.
Not have any kind of.
Right.
Yeah. Discussion with your therapist.
Right. Right.
What would you say are some practices that religionists, people who are believers or still part of a congregation or are thinking about joining a new congregation, what would you recommend they put in place to avoid or prevent being exposed or subjected to religious trauma?
I think just seeing a church or church leaders as infallible is going to lead to problems, because no church or church leader is going to be perfect. So if you assume that your church is right on everything, then eventually you're going to get a point where the dissonance between what's taught and what you experience is going to be very painful.
Tell me, what kinds of practices should religious trauma sufferers implement to help in their healing journey? Daily practices that they could engage in.
The answer to everything in life, and I don't say this tongue in cheek, truly, the answer to everything in life is self-acceptance and self-compassion. And I tell all of my clients that if we could skip to the end of therapy right now, what that would look like would be absolute self-acceptance and absolute self-compassion. None of us can do that because, we weren't all born Buddhist monks, right? Like maybe, I don't know, maybe Buddhist monks can do that coming out of the womb. I'm not sure. But we haven't been taught self-acceptance and self-compassion in our Western culture. And I think particularly in religious cultures, we have a lot of self-rejection. Like our kind of default is self-rejection. So learning to have self-acceptance and self-compassion is literally the key to life. And I can recommend books if you want books.
Well, yeah. Do you have off the top of your head some books to recommend?
I do. I really like Tara Brach's Radical Acceptance. And I always tell people, as a type A recovering perfectionist, I was really put off by the concept of radical acceptance. And I only read it because I knew I needed it for my clients. And then I had to read it 3 times for it to really get into my head, because it was so opposite to how my brain naturally works. So if you hate it, that's good. And it means you need it. And maybe read it. And I don't read anything 3 times because I've got a whole list to get through. So I really recommend that. And I also really recommend The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion by Christopher Germer. And those 2 authors, they must be friends with each other. They reference each other's work quite a bit. The Mindful Path, and they both are practicing Buddhists. They're both licensed psychologists as well, if I remember correctly. The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion is a little bit denser and thicker. If it's too much to get through, there are lots of workbooks out there on self-compassion. So if you aren't the person to sit down and read a 300-page book with research and everything in it, that's okay. Get a workbook. There are lots of self-compassion workbooks on Amazon.
Perfect. Thank you for that. It's funny. I hate radical acceptance almost on principle.
Yes, me too. Read her book 3 times.
And yet I pushed back. I resisted radical acceptance for so long. And it took EMDR rewiring my brain, and now I get it. And it actually comes fairly easy now in a lot of areas.